CargoWise Landside is deeply committed to revolutionizing landside logistics. With a complete enterprise system built for modern trucking and container drayage operators that includes proven drayage transportation management, digital rate and quote management, real-time container track and tracing, and on-demand truck, trailer, and container storage. Excellence in container drayage starts with the right software. Enhance transportation management, optimize shipment execution, and improve intermodal business operations with Trinium TMS, Draymaster, GeoStamp Track, and SecureSpace. To learn more, please visit cargowise.com/landside.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to TPM Today. Today is the July 11th episode of our show, which is the second and fourth Fridays every month, 10 a.m. Eastern. I am definitely not on Eastern time right now. I'm actually in northern India in the foothills of the Himalayas on my customary sojourn to India over the summer. Having a fantastic time talking to people in the logistics industry here. I visited the Taj Mahal earlier this week. I'm eating my weight in mangoes. I'm having a ball. I'm doing okay over here. So always a pleasure to be over here. I really love being over here, but I also love doing my show from here. I have a fantastic guest. I'm really excited for her to speak with her in a bit, and she's gonna be joining in just a few minutes. But as usual, a few things to get through. So I just wanted to mention I'm speaking at a bunch of different conferences and meetings in fall, which is just around the corner. We're already like halfway through summer, it feels like. I'm going to be at the Four Kites event in late August. I will be at the Logicin event in mid-September. I will, of course, be at our own Inland Distribution Conference, or Inland 25, the end of September. I'm speaking at a couple more, the VMA event, RateLinks event, Shipio event through later in the fall. So if you're at any of those events, let's catch up. I would love to talk to you in person. That's, the best part of going to events is actually that face-to-face contact with people instead of Zoom calls and videos like this. So, but in the meantime, we'll make do with our show today. Inland is, as I mentioned, 11 weeks away, which is crazy. We've been planning this out since last January. So we're sort of in the home stretch now. If you've not registered, register now. You can use the code EJ10 or EJ10, I believe, to get 10% off new registrations for the event. You don't want to miss it. I keep saying this, it is the most substantive event in freight transportation. And I promise you will not be sorry if you register for the event. So just connect with me if you have any questions about that. All right, really quickly, one story I wanted to highlight. This actually just published yesterday. I've been working on this through the week. Interesting wrinkle. Obviously, tariffs have been the word of the year so far this year. Wrote yesterday about the administration's sort of confusion that's been caused about Vietnam, tariffs on Vietnam, and specifically tariffs on Vietnamese or goods that are deemed to be originally from China, routed through Vietnam, and then sailing from Vietnam, but are sort of designated with the country of origin of Vietnam, and whether that's being cracked down upon by the administration and by CBP. Right now, so this was announced earlier in July that the tariff levels on Vietnam would be 20% and 40% for goods that were quote unquote transshipped. Now, first of all, anyone in the world of containerized transportation thinks of transshipment as cargo moving from one vessel to another vessel through a third port. In this case, transshipment has a sort of different definition, which I go into in this story. I talked to a bunch of different trade and trade compliance experts about like whether it's just me that's finding this confusing or whether they and importers are finding this confusing. They are definitely all finding it confusing. primarily because there has not been an agreement sort of in writing. There's been an announcement that there's been an agreement, but so much is in the air. And I think this is just sort of symptomatic of the confusion that's out there in the import community. So, the beat kind of goes on this, and we'll be watching. Obviously, more deals have been announced or sort of indicated over the last week. So go to joc.com and find out about the latest on all of those things. With no further ado, I'm super excited to bring my guest on this week. Angi Acocella, I think I got that right, is a research scientist at the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics. Angi and I were introduced just a few months ago by someone who said very excitedly we needed to meet, and that person was extremely right. We had an awesome first conversation. She is doing super interesting things with MIT, which I'm super familiar with because I used to go to their the event that they had every March, which I think you still have, right?
Well, 20 something years we've been doing it.
The summit, right? The transportation summit. So, Angi, so glad to have you on the show. Give people a little bit of your background before you came to MIT and then sort of into the role you're in now.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, thank you for the introduction. I came to supply chain and transportation by roundabout routes. So I actually was a mechanical engineer, systems engineer working in semiconductors and in energy systems. And I found that some of the work that I was doing was in transporting alternative fuel, production and transport of alternative fuels. And I realized the problem was not a technology problem. From the engineer in me, I was like, this is a technology problem. But then I started thinking about it more, and it was really more of a transportation problem. I ended up pursuing a PhD in transportation logistics. That's actually, I did my PhD at MIT at CTL, and then have kind of fallen in love with transportation and logistics since then. So I did my PhD. I left. I worked in the Netherlands for a few years, working with the Port of Rotterdam and Tilburg University in the south of the Netherlands, and then came back. So here I am back as a full-time research scientist. Because the type of work, and we'll talk about it, but the type of work that we can do and the interactions with industry that we get to do as researchers from CTL is you can't get anywhere else. So I couldn't stay away for too long, so I came back.
Well, it's that. I mean, obviously, the same thing is I didn't grow up wanting to be in transportation and logistics, but you get a little taste of it, and for whatever reason, it grabs you, right? So I totally on board, or same page as you on that. So okay, for people who don't know, I think what MIT does in the world of freight transportation is unique. Not that they're the only university that sort of has an academic kind of function around this, but I think MIT has a special place in the industry in terms of its role. So what is the FreightLab? What do you do there specifically? Who do you tend to work with?
Yeah. And there's layers to it, right? So I talk about Center for Transportation and Logistics, which within the center, we have all sorts of labs from, ours being my specific one being FreightLab. We have humanitarian logistics, supply chains, digital, anything you can think about within supply chain and logistics, we have it within CTL, the Center for Transportation and Logistics. FreightLab is where I work. So this is where we essentially study anything that moves, right? Anything that moves, any goods that move from point A to point B is what we study. So we work with shippers, we work with carriers, we work with brokers, and this is the part that I think makes us very unique. We work with industry to identify, a problem, and then decide what is some research that we can do that can help improve. Maybe it's a strategy or a tool that we can develop. And so we work on a lot of what we worked on is on transportation procurement, which we can get into some of those projects on, contracting and pricing and when to use spot and market dynamics, things like that. It's been most of my research, most of my PhD work, and then everything since then. But we work on things like truck driver needs, and them being identified as essential workers, transportation during emergencies, stuff on sustainability and zero emissions. So we have a lot of different kind of directions within FreightLab, but essentially, we work with companies to identify what do they need, what are their current challenges, and then how can we start to identify research topics to mitigate those challenges.
So you work with you mentioned shipper, broker, carrier, you work with all of those entities. Explain how that works. is there a problem that the private sector comes to you with? Is it a problem that's sort of like a one-to-one thing where like a carrier says we're having trouble optimizing this, or a shipper says, I don't know how to handle, I don't know how to allocate, my volume to the different channels that I have. Is there a way to help me out with that? Or does it tend to be like broader than that, or more of like a coalition where it's like multiple parties? So how does the first step taken?
Yeah.
Basically?
A little all of the above, and that's not maybe, but I'll kind of give examples here. So sometimes it's, a shipper saying they have a very specific issue. I'll talk about one project we did where it was a shipper who they contracted volume, but they also had their own dedicated capacity. And essentially what they were trying to do was, routing, so minimize empty miles. But it was a procurement issue. It was, how do we procure every single lane, given we want a contract, maybe we want to use some spot. We also have this dedicated capacity. So how do we procure every lane so that we're minimizing costs, but also reducing or minimizing empty miles driven? And so that was a very specific thing. We offered essentially a tool. We call it a procurement engine. And it was essentially they could take all of their historical lanes, their volumes, throw it into this tool, and it would spit out kind of how should every lane be procured. So that was kind of a very specific thing. But then it gets to, maybe I'm working with some brokers who are looking at how do they become, knowledge forward for their customers. So it's more strategic types of questions. A lot of the work I've done on market dynamics. So how should we help shippers in general think about the timing of their procurement events given market dynamics? When prices are going up or prices are going down, what makes sense? Things like spot versus contract, that portfolio of how much should go to contract versus how much should go to spot. We can generalize those things by working with often brokers who have data that's kind of many different shippers and many different carriers. So we can generalize a little bit better when we work with a broker, for example. Carriers, kind of same thing. You have a little bit of, a lot of them will think about like pricing or things like that, but it might be a little more specific. Our job as researchers then are to, we have this pull between being applied research that has impact for companies, but also then having an academic, aspect to it. And so we then have to figure out as an academic, how do we generalize this? Where are the characteristics that we can start to pull out of it that actually are generalizable? And we can then share that with not just the company that we're working with, but put out an academic paper or put out, communications for the broader industry that can help them.
So, okay, that's interesting. And I don't want to get maybe too down the rabbit hole of like the minutia of like the ultimate goal for academia, but like you have, is the ultimate goal like to find a problem that exists in the industry and help the industry solve it? Or is the problem to do that as well as put out research and papers that like people can then use down the road as like reference on how to solve that problem? If you get what I'm asking.
Absolutely. Okay. It's both. It's we particularly, and I think this is where academia is going a lot more recently, is that application to industry, that push to be kind of a thought leader as an academic, right? We need to be able to communicate what we're doing in the lab or in our code or our analytics to actually help industry, but it's still our job to make it academic in the sense that we're rigorous in our analysis. We can demonstrate that it's not just a very specific coincidence that we've identified, but we can actually generalize it. And so there's that twofold, that two different directions that we kind of have to go with our research. But it's, at least for me, it's fun to be able to have different layers or different levels of the research, right? And we can talk about this more, but I often try to have different, 3 different audiences in mind when I'm communicating my research. There's the academic, the conferences, the papers, which are important for us because that's how we build then on the research and the level of knowledge. But then also, a transportation practitioner and then just a general practitioner. I need to be able to communicate all of those things. Otherwise, I don't have the impact that I could have. The research, to have the impact, I feel, needs to be both in the academic setting so we can build off of our knowledge, but then also the impact in reality too, right, in practice.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, big picture, like academia is under this like incredible scanner right now in terms of like it's a different institution than it was. Academia at large is a different institution than it was like when I was growing up. I'm sure when you were growing up, there's a lot more scrutiny about, its role in the economy and society. So very interesting to see you sort of, or hear you talk about like balancing those different sort of drivers for what you're doing. I did want to ask specifically, because this came up a lot in our chats, was procurement, right? This is an area that I feel like a lot of my reporting has been on. I'm personally super interested in procurement. I personally feel like it's the most important process of all of the processes that happen in transportation. What drew you to that specific like area, and what's kept you sort of like super interested and engaged in that area?
I think, yeah, back to our early conversation. I think what I love is meeting folks like yourself where we can just talk and talk and talk about procurement for forever. So when you asked me to be on the show, I said, yes, absolutely. We'll chat about procurement as long as you want to. Yeah, I mean, partially it came from back to my roots as like an engineer. I really like analytics. I really like the data, like science aspect of what you can do in procurement. So when it comes to pricing or game theory or things like that. But there's another part of me that really enjoys the kind of human element, the social element to procurement. So, you can optimize to your heart's extent to determine, minimum cost allocation of carriers or pricing. But things are not going to go that way in reality, right? There's relationships, there are operational uncertainty and challenges that you can't capture in a perfect model, right? In an optimization model or anything like that. And so what I really like about it is that the balance between doing some analytics around, how do we improve pricing? How do we improve contracting? How do we allocate better and save costs and get better efficiencies, right? While also recognizing there's a human element. And so that's where basically a lot of my work is marrying those two together, right? So the first work I was doing was market dynamics. In the past, no one had really explicitly considering market dynamics, these soft and tight markets that we have cyclically in strategic procurement decisions. It was always kind of like, well, relationships matter, you want to get the lowest cost possible, lock in low rates, things like that. And my work was showing that that's not a great strategy because if you lock in low prices, you're a shipper, you lock in low prices in a soft market, or as the market is starting to tighten, those contract prices are not going to be valid in a month, 2 months, 3 months, right? And I think there was a knowledge of that in the industry, right? There was a knowledge of that, but game theory or kind of analytics would say, we'll get the lowest price possible and just stick with it. The reality of transportation is that, well, there's an alternative option. Your market prices are not, market prices are going to be stronger influences. And so, trying to understand what should we be including in these strategic decisions, in these operational decisions, given the realities, the complexities that we have in freight. I think it also comes down to the fact that we call them non-binding contracts in truckload in particular, right, in the US, where we say they're binding in price, meaning any volume that goes through them is going to go at that price, but they're non-binding in volume or capacity, meaning the shipper doesn't have to offer any or all of the expected volume, and the carriers don't have to accept, now there's service level requirements, right, or expectations, but it's one of the only contracts where you actually where compliance.
There's no penalty for not abiding by the contract.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's a service level. It's not a requirement, right? And there's flexibility there. And so I thought that was really fascinating as well, because you have so many dynamics there. What is, if acceptance goes down to 90%, is that okay? Well, what about 85%, right? And so all these dynamics you have to consider when you're, looking at your annual procurement of hundreds, thousands of lanes. So I thought all that messiness was fascinating.
It's like the most complex problem, honestly. Yeah. And I think the thing that's drawn me to it, I cover technology, and there's a lot of companies that have tried to, somewhat successfully to very successfully, like build tools to enable some of the considerations that you talked about. Yeah. But at the end of the day, like a lot of people in transportation roles consider like negotiating and having a gut instinct about which carrier is the right one to move at any given moment. It's that classic, like, is the human better at doing this, or is the data or the automated kind of version of this better at doing it? And also the point you just made about companies spend a huge amount of time on procurement events. And is there a way, like, if you get them off of this idea that that has to be the way it's done, like, is there a way, even if they're marginally less good at it, but they spend 10% of the FTE hours doing what they did, like, that might be a good trade-off to make, right? So
related, not necessarily to the technology piece, but some research I had done on, I've talked about this a lot, ghost lanes. And so essentially, about 70% of truckload contracts that are set up never end up getting used, never sees volume materialize through them.
So in other words, you go through the negotiation process of agreeing with a carrier to move on that lane, and then you never end up moving anything on that lane.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we think about these procurement events as, 3 months, 6 months, maybe of the forecasting, the pre-negotiations, everything, right? And then the whole bid process. And so the question is, well, one, why are we doing this? There's many reasons, but there's this Linus's blanket type of feeling of contracts. We want to stay out of the spot market, so we contract everything. But are there repercussions for it? So the research showed that yes, there's price and performance repercussions for doing that, having a high rate of ghost lanes. But then the next question is, well, okay, what if we remove those lanes from the procurement event and strategically use spot? We looked at that. Actually, we see that is also a better option, especially because these lanes tend to be low volume, and the 80% of lanes that are 20% of the volume, right? Those lanes that don't need to be procured. But then as I was presenting this and over the years talking with shippers who were thinking about, okay, well, we're going to remove, low volume lanes, anything that's less than 10 shipments, we'll remove from the procurement event. And I asked them, do you take less time from your procurement event? And a lot of the feedback was, we don't necessarily take less time. We don't necessarily put less FTE into it, but we are focusing more on the important lanes. So we're able to get better carrier negotiations, we get better prices. Our carrier understands our business better, and vice versa, right? So we don't necessarily put less effort into the procurement event, although I think that we should also try to do that, aim to do that. But we're getting better results on the important stuff, the 20% of lanes that are 80% of the volume.
Yep. So, I mean, we could do the whole show about procurement, and maybe at some point on stage at an event, we'll do that. I'll have you on and we can just completely nerd out about this, but I have too much ground to cover. So back to the academic thing and the focus that MIT specifically has had around like engaging with the private sector. Is it fair to say that the private sector sort of underappreciates or underutilizes the resources that are at MIT or some of the other like supply chain focused universities?
Yeah. I think short answer, yes. And partially there's like structural reasons for it, I think. The first is back to kind of that communication. You need to have, as a researcher, you need to have the skill to both communicate to academic audiences, which is what our jobs typically are dependent on, right? Is paper output and things like that to get tenure and things like that. But you also have to spend the time and energy and resources to communicate better in the language that a practitioner can understand. And that skill isn't really taught well, I think, to upcoming PhD students and things like that. I think there's also a timeline mismatch. So, my papers, so the ghost lanes, let's talk about that, for example, as an example. I've been presenting that for years. That is not a paper that's published yet because the academic timeline is it's years, right? To get it from a paper.
The peer review and all the.
So it's, and then there's grant cycles and, things like that, trying to get new research to come in. The timelines are so different. And then I think related to that, companies don't necessarily see the benefit of slower progress because it doesn't return that, that or ROI isn't really there, right? You don't have that, like, I need an answer tomorrow or in a month from now, not a year from now when you get the paperwork done and we hire a PhD student and all of those things. So I think those timelines are a big challenge.
Very interesting. I have one other question, and then there was a question that came in that I wanted to maybe get your take on because it's like a more topical, recent thing. Where do you think? So the technology side is obviously the area I focus on. Where, as you know, over the course of the time you've been focused on transportation and logistics, where would you say we are from a like? Is the software industry sort of reached a place where it's serving the industry well, and now it's back to your point about like culture and like acceptance of things versus like the technology is not there or is or isn't there, like is it now more of a cultural thing, or does the technology still need to progress to like solve some of the things that you're working on?
Yeah, I think we're progressing. I think it's uneven, right? So there's certain instances where technology's worked well and is kind of continuing to progress. So I think of like visibility, for example. There's been a lot that's been ongoing for 10 years maybe, and getting better and better, and we're finding
Longer.
Yeah, probably
20 years. It's been yeah.
And so, we have, obviously it helps with planning, but then we're thinking about how does that help with tracking emissions? I mean, so we're thinking of even more uses for it.
Yep.
I will separate from autonomous AVs and EVs because that's a whole nother show maybe. Sticking to like,
and that's not software. Yeah.
Totally. But like with procurement, this is, where my heart is and your heart is on like pricing algorithms. So APIs within the routing guide. We're seeing a few instances of that. And I think there's solid value there because a lot of work that I've done back to like fixed prices are not going to be a solid choice given market dynamics. So how do you get a combination of the benefits of contract versus spot without, using the 4-letter word, which is spot? You have these API, pricing type of algorithms that some companies are starting to use and create that, in the routing guide. I think that's an area where it needs to demonstrate savings a little bit more before it really gets held on. But I think the value is there for that type of thing. And, also that a piece of that has been in the past, the TMSs were not set up well enough to have this somewhat dynamic price in them. So we've also seen a little bit better advancements in TMSs to be able to then either help the communication or also enable
integrate with that.
Exactly. I think those are actually what I've seen in the last years in advancing and needs to continue to advance. But I think that's where there's benefit.
So I realized that was a very general question to ask you, like, is technology in the trucking industry advancing? There's a million different flavors of that.
Yeah.
Real quickly, there was a question that came in around, and I'm just sort of interested if this is something that's on MIT's radar yet, because it's relatively new. The English language requirement that's now being enforced, the administration sort of focused on making sure that drivers are proficient in English. Is that something yet that's registering in terms of like things that you are working on, or someone, one of your colleagues is working on yet? Because I know it's become a hot button issue of late. And there are various theories about how much it might impact capacity in the market too. So
totally. And that's where I was going to go with it. So we haven't explicitly looked at the English language requirement. Where we try to look at is that capacity in the market, right? Driver retention, driver availability. It makes me think a little bit of some of the work that I was doing when I was in Europe on the truck driver situation. We have a lot of drivers from Eastern Europe that then come into Western, the Western part, Central and Western Europe. But then there's challenges of language barriers, right? So I see that there's a challenge there, but we're looking at, okay, but do we even have a driver shortage or this driver churn? We're looking a little bit more into that, and how do we retain drivers and create an environment for drivers where they want to stay. We're doing some work on like fatigue for drivers and how do we help route such that they can get home when they want to. So it falls, not that specifically, it's kind of a long answer to say.
It's new. Yeah, exactly. You were talking about the cycles in academia run differently than like
also that. Yeah. But in terms of like, how do we maintain a solid, sustainable level of drivers within the US? That's something we're definitely working on. I think this plays into how do we make sure that we have a draw to that work environment, such that we can get people that, it's not the American truck driver of the 70s and 80s that we had movies about anymore. So how do we improve that?
Yep. Last question. We're up against time here. Unfortunately, I could talk a lot more about this. I asked this every guest, who's your favorite band or musician? And you have to say why.
Okay. This is going to give away that I'm a millennial. My favorite band, and I've been obsessed with recently, is Linkin Park. And this is because I grew up with them, right? I was a teenager in high school when they were really big. I think they've been so powerful in reinventing themselves recently, but also they were one of the last bands that like played their own instruments. They had incredible different types of vocals. They were producing music. They had such range between like, rap almost to rock to like grunge. They had such range. They were so talented. They inspired a whole music generation, and they've been able to reinvent themselves for decades. So I say Linkin Park.
All right, cool. That's a new name to add to the TPM Today playlist. I appreciate it, Angie. What's a good way for people to reach out to you?
Yep. So I'm on LinkedIn. If you see my name, you can just find me on LinkedIn. Also, email is just my last name at mit.edu.
Perfect. This has been awesome. I knew it would be. Thank you so much for coming on today. And please reach out to Angie if you have anything you want to discuss. I'm sure she'd be super pumped to talk to anybody who's listening in today. Thanks so much. Yeah. We'll talk soon, okay?
Sounds good.
All right, cool. I'm way past time, so I'm going to quickly run through dad joke of the week. Why do melons have weddings? Why do melons have weddings? Because they can't elope. That's a pretty good one, right? That's like a rock solid dad joke. Thank you, Angie. Thank you to the Let's Talk Supply Chain team for making this the easiest thing I do all week. Thank you most of all to everyone tuning in. Always appreciate the support for the show. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another great guest, so tune in then. Thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic weekend.